At 13, most boys are taught how to avoid danger. They are warned, shielded, supervised, and slowly taught how to stay safe. In one East African culture, the lesson was the opposite. Boys were taught to walk toward fear instead of away from it. Not to impress anyone, not to prove toughness, and not to chase violence. But to learn, early, what fear feels like when you refuse to let it decide for you. There was no comfort built into this moment. No speech about bravery, no promise of rescue, no safety net hidden nearby. Fear was not treated as a phase or a weakness that time would solve. It was treated as a force that grows stronger when avoided. The belief was simple and ruthless: if fear is not confronted early, it becomes permanent. So instead of waiting for adulthood, they forced the encounter while the mind was still flexible. This was never about creating violent men. And it was never about proving who was strongest. It was a psychological system designed to separate fear from decision-making. The Maasai understood that fear does not disappear with age, it settles into identity. So they removed boys from protection before fear could harden into hesitation. What they created instead were men who could feel fear and still act clearly. To understand why this worked, we have to look at the moment childhood ended. Not with celebration, applause, or reassurance, but with silence, distance, and responsibility placed fully on one young boy. This was the moment he learned that fear could exist without controlling him. That lesson stayed long after the wilderness was behind him, and it shaped how he would face pain, conflict, and uncertainty for the rest of his life. This is not a story about copying the past. It is about understanding a lesson most modern societies abandoned. We raise boys surrounded by safety but starve them of initiation. Then we wonder why fear follows them into adulthood. On ancient paths of men, we study these forgotten systems not to glorify them, but to learn from them. Because some ideas were never meant to be comfortable, only effective. They didn't raise boys the way most societies do. They did not optimize childhood for comfort, entertainment, or prolonged innocence. They treated boyhood as a temporary state, not an identity to protect indefinitely. From the beginning, everyone knew childhood had an expiration date. When that date arrived, protection was withdrawn deliberately, not accidentally. Because protection, in their worldview, was useful only until it became a liability. The goal was not to harden boys into cruelty. It was to prevent fear from becoming their inner authority. Fear, left untreated, turns into hesitation, avoidance, and quiet obedience. The Maasai understood that a fearful man is easy to control. So courage was not treated as a personality trait. It was treated as a skill that had to be installed early. This is why age mattered so much. Around 13, the mind is no longer a child's, but not yet fixed. Fear can still be reshaped instead of suppressed. Habits are forming, but identity is not yet locked in place. The Maasai did not choose this age randomly or casually. They chose it because delay would make fear permanent. When the day arrived, it was not announced dramatically. There were no speeches about bravery or destiny. Drama would have fed fear, not removed it. Instead, the transition happened quietly. A boy was simply no longer treated as someone who needed shielding. And that silence was part of the lesson. Being sent into the wild was not about combat. It was about exposure without rescue. Darkness, distance, hunger, uncertainty, and isolation were the real teachers. The environment did not negotiate or reassure. The boy had to learn how his mind behaved when comfort disappeared. That observation was more important than anything he encountered outside. Lions are often mentioned in modern retellings. But the lion was never the point. Running from fear would have failed the test even without danger present. The real challenge was staying composed when imagination turned uncertainty into threat. Fear had to be experienced without being obeyed. Only then could it lose its authority. What mattered most was not what happened outside. It was what happened internally. Breathing under pressure. Thinking without panic. Remaining still when instinct demanded movement. This is how fear was separated from action. Coming back was not a celebration. There were no emotional reunions or praise-filled welcomes. Returning simply meant the boy had crossed a threshold. Fear had been introduced, and survived. That alone changed how the community related to him. He was no longer treated as someone who needed to be protected from himself. What happened if a boy returned visibly afraid was more telling. He was not beaten. He was not exiled. But he was not trusted either. Fear signaled immaturity, not failure. And trust, once withheld, was harder to earn than endurance. Pain was temporary. Hunger passed. Cold ended. But shame lasted because it lived inside the social structure. The Maasai understood that social consequence shapes behavior more deeply than punishment. Fear was discouraged not through force, but through meaning. Over time, this system produced something modern societies rarely do. Men who were not fearless, but were unruled by fear. They could feel it without obeying it. They could assess danger without panic. Calm became a default state, not a performance. And that calm carried into leadership, conflict, and responsibility. This is where the contrast with modern life becomes uncomfortable. We delay confrontation with fear indefinitely. We soften every edge, remove every trial, and call it care. Then we act surprised when anxiety follows people into adulthood. Fear that is never tested never shrinks. It only learns to hide. On ancient paths of men, this is the pattern we keep encountering. Ancient cultures treated fear as a problem to solve, not a feeling to accommodate. They did not wait for adulthood to introduce difficulty. They introduced difficulty to protect adulthood. The methods were harsh by modern standards, but the outcomes were precise. And this leaves us with a difficult question. What happens when initiation disappears entirely? When boys are never asked to face themselves without protection? When fear is always deferred, managed, or medicated instead of challenged? The Maasai answered this question long ago. Modern society is still trying to avoid it. We can't copy the ritual, but we can understand the mechanism behind it. The Maasai were not trying to create suffering for its own sake. They were engineering a psychological outcome. Fear was introduced early, in a controlled but undeniable way. And once fear was faced, it lost its mystery. When fear remains unknown, it grows in imagination. When it is met directly, it becomes measurable. The boy learned what fear actually felt like in his body. He learned how long it lasted, how it rose, and how it fell. That experience replaced fantasy with familiarity. And familiarity stripped fear of its power. This is why the system worked without constant repetition. Fear does not need to be conquered every day once it is understood. The memory of facing it once becomes a reference point. Later challenges are compared against that moment. Most of them feel smaller by comparison. That single initiation quietly recalibrated the nervous system. Modern systems rarely offer this calibration. Fear is delayed instead of confronted. Children are taught avoidance long before they learn regulation. Discomfort is framed as damage rather than information. So fear grows without boundaries. And adulthood inherits it intact. This doesn't produce safer adults. It produces hesitant ones. Men who feel fear intensely but have no reference point for it. Men who confuse anxiety with intuition. Men who wait for certainty that never arrives. Fear becomes their silent advisor. The Maasai avoided this by making fear familiar early. Not through explanation. Not through reassurance. But through experience that could not be ignored. Fear was treated like fire, dangerous, but instructive. Once touched carefully, it was no longer mysterious. This familiarity produced calm, not recklessness. A man who knows fear does not seek it unnecessarily. But he does not flee from it either. He evaluates, decides, and moves forward deliberately. That balance is what leadership requires. And it was cultivated on purpose. This is why these men were trusted with responsibility early. Not because they were fearless, but because fear no longer ruled their reactions. They could be relied on in uncertainty. They could hold tension without collapsing. That reliability mattered more than strength. On ancient paths of men, This pattern appears again and again. Ancient cultures built systems to prepare men for pressure. Modern cultures often outsource that preparation to chance. Some men encounter initiation accidentally through trauma. Others never encounter it at all. Both outcomes are unstable. This leaves one final distinction worth sitting with. Initiation was not about suffering. It was about timing. Fear introduced too late becomes identity. Fear introduced early becomes information. That difference shapes an entire life. The question is not whether we should return to the past. We shouldn't. The question is whether we understand what the past was solving. Because the problem did not disappear. Only the system that addressed it did. And nature always collects unpaid debts. If this way of thinking feels unsettling, that's a good sign. It means an assumption has been challenged. Fear is not always the enemy, but letting it mature unchecked is. Ancient cultures knew this intuitively. We are still relearning it intellectually. From here, the path only gets deeper. There are other cultures, other rites, other systems designed for the same outcome. This was not an isolated idea. It was a pattern. If you value ideas that survive trends, subscribe. Not for answers, but for questions that sharpen how you see the world. This is Ancient Paths of Men. And the path forward is never meant to be easy, only meaningful.